My parents kicked me out on Christmas Eve into the freezing Atlanta rain with absolutely nothing. They stood on the porch of their multi-million-dollar estate and laughed, telling me I could never survive on my own without their holy grace. Desperate and shivering, I walked into an elite downtown bank the next morning to try an old battered card my grandfather had hidden for me years ago. The bank manager took one look at the account screen, turned completely pale, rushed me into a high-security vault, locked the heavy metal door, and whispered that I needed to sit down immediately. I had no idea that a single piece of black plastic was about to completely destroy my family's fake religious empire. My name is Zuri. I am 35 years old, and my life changed the moment I realized my family viewed me as a disposable pawn. Before I share exactly what was on that computer screen, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against a toxic family that tried to use you. The tension in the formal dining room of my father's estate was so thick, it felt like trying to breathe underwater. We were gathered around a massive custom mahogany table for our traditional Christmas Eve dinner. Bishop Ezekiel, my father, sat at the head of the table, radiating his usual manufactured authority. My mother, First Lady Corinne, sat to his right, draped in expensive silk and smelling of heavy floral perfume. My parents had spent the last 3 decades building a mega-church empire that prized respectability politics above all else. They believed that wealth, status, and the appearance of perfection were the ultimate signs of divine favor. Because I chose to study data and finance instead of marrying a pastor or joining the church administration, I was treated as an embarrassing afterthought. I was the dark-skinned daughter who looked exactly like my grandfather Jeremiah, a man who believed in grassroots community work, while my sister Iman was the polished golden child who mirrored my mother's obsession with high society validation. I had always been the scapegoat, the one expected to sacrifice my time and resources for the family without ever receiving a single word of gratitude. I had temporarily moved out of my own apartment and back into their house 3 weeks ago to physically care for my mother after her major hip replacement surgery. I had cooked the meals, managed her daily medications, coordinated her physical therapy, and handled the household staff so she could rest. But gratitude was not a currency my family ever traded in. Tonight, she was not passing the sweet potato pie or offering a holiday prayer of thanksgiving. Instead, she reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a thick legal document, and slid the manila folder across the pristine white tablecloth directly toward my plate. "Sign over your grandfather Jeremiah's community center, Zuri." My mother demanded, her tone flat and completely devoid of any holiday warmth. "Harrison's development firm needs the land cleared by Monday morning so they can break ground on the new church parking pavilion." I stared at the legal waiver sitting right next to my half-eaten dinner. My grandfather Jeremiah had built that community center with his bare hands 40 years ago to serve the neighborhood. When he passed away, he left the deed solely in my name, trusting me to protect it because he knew exactly what my parents were capable of. I looked up at my mother, maintaining my composure despite the sudden spike in my heart rate. "That center feeds 50 families a week, Mom," I said, clearly pushing the legal document back across the table. "And I certainly did not forget how you convinced me to sell off Jeremiah's historic barbershop 5 years ago, just to pay for Iman's first vanity wedding, the one where her groom left her 6 months later. I am not giving up the center so you can have more VIP parking for your Sunday broadcasts." Across the table, my younger sister Iman scoffed loudly. She was the undisputed golden child of the family, practically glowing in a sequined holiday dress and twirling a massive diamond ring from her second husband. Iman leaned forward, her perfectly manicured nails tapping aggressively against her crystal wine glass. "You are so incredibly dramatic," Zuri, Iman sneered. "You are a 35-year-old unmarried, childless financial strategist. You sit behind a desk looking at spreadsheets all day. You have absolutely no right to question real visionary business moves made by actual leaders. The community center is an absolute eyesore. It brings down the property value of the entire church district. We are trying to elevate our brand, and you are holding on to a rusty relic just to be difficult and spiteful." I felt my jaw tighten. "A rusty relic?" I asked. That relic provides after-school programs for kids who have nowhere else to go. It is the last piece of true community left on that block before the church swallowed everything else up for television broadcast facilities and VIP parking lots. You call it elevating the brand Iman. I call it erasing our history. That was when Harrison decided to insert himself into the conversation. Harrison was Iman's white husband, a real estate developer who had charmed his way into my father's inner circle by promising to expand the megachurch's massive footprint. He had a habit of cloaking his greed in the language of salvation and progress. He offered me a patronizing, sympathetic smile that made my skin crawl. "Now, Zuri, let us look at the bigger picture here," Harrison said, adopting a soothing, condescending tone as if he were explaining basic math to a difficult toddler. That historic neighborhood needs modern renewal. The demographics are shifting. The infrastructure is failing. By building the new parking pavilion and the adjacent upscale coffee shop, we are actually uplifting the community. We are bringing in revenue and revitalizing the area. You are standing in the way of progress out of some misplaced nostalgic loyalty. We are trying to help these people. I set my fork down and turned my full attention to my brother-in-law. The sheer audacity of this man sitting at my family's table, eating the food I cooked, and lecturing me about what a historic African-American neighborhood needed was entirely too much to bear. "Help these people," I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "Do not sit there and pretend you are some kind of urban savior, Harrison. I work in financial strategy. I have seen the public records for your development firm. I know exactly how you operate." I leaned forward, locking eyes with him across the table. "You do not uplift communities. You sweep in secure, predatory, high-interest loans against existing small businesses, force them into default, and then buy the foreclosed properties for pennies on the dollar to build overpriced luxury condos. Your firm currently has a debt-to-income ratio that should terrify any legitimate investor. You are completely overextended. You took out bridge loans to cover your last 3 failed developments, and now the balloon payments are due. You thought you could marry into my family, manipulate my parents with your holy savior complex, and steal my grandfather's land to balance your disastrous accounting. You do not want the community center land to build a church parking lot. You need my land to use as collateral, so your creditors do not file for bankruptcy against your holding company by the end of the fiscal year. You are nothing but a corporate parasite feeding off my family's congregation." The dining room fell into a deathly silence, my father's fork hovered halfway to his mouth. My mother's eyes darted between Harrison and me. Harrison's patronizing smile completely vanished, replaced by a pale, rigid mask of absolute panic. The color drained from his face as he realized I had completely seen through his fraudulent facade. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The silence was violently shattered by Iman. Her face flushed a deep, furious red. The realization that I had just exposed her husband's financial desperation in front of our parents sent her over the edge. She kicked her chair back violently and lunged across the mahogany table. Her hands grabbed the collar of my silk blouse, pulling me forward and knocking over glasses in the process. "You are a jealous, barren spinster trying to ruin my husband's legacy!" Iman screamed, spit flying from her lips as her grip tightened on my clothes. "You cannot stand that I have a successful marriage and a beautiful life while you have nothing. You are nothing but a bitter failure." The sound of shattering crystal echoed through the dining room before I could even open my mouth to respond to my sister. My father, Bishop Ezekiel, had slammed his heavy fist onto the custom mahogany table with such sheer force that his water glass tipped and exploded, sending glittering shards and ice water flying across the lavish holiday centerpiece. He stood up slowly, drawing himself up to his full imposing height, smoothing the lapels of his tailored suit with shaking hands. The veins in his neck bulged against his stiff white collar. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. "You will not sit at my table and disrespect the anointed leaders of this family," he bellowed, letting his booming pulpit voice fill the space. "You will not bring your secular, ungrateful spirit into this house and insult your sister and her husband on the eve of our holy celebration. Harrison is expanding our ministry. He is doing important work for the community, and you, Zuri, are a prideful, insolent woman who has forgotten her place. I took you back into my home out of the goodness of my heart, and this is how you repay our charity." The sheer hypocrisy of his words hit me like a physical blow. Took me back into his home out of the goodness of his heart. I had a gorgeous luxury apartment downtown. I had given up my lease, packed up my entire independent life, and moved back into my childhood bedroom 3 weeks ago for one reason only. My mother, First Lady Corinne, had undergone a complex hip replacement surgery. Iman was too busy curating her fake faith-based lifestyle brand on social media to help, and Harrison certainly was not going to lift a finger to assist his mother-in-law. They expected me, the unmarried daughter, the designated beast of burden, to be the unpaid live-in nurse. I had managed her medications, coordinated her physical therapy, cooked her specialized meals, and bathed her, all while running my financial strategy firm remotely from a tiny desk in the corner of my room. "I moved back here to wipe your wife's forehead and empty her bedpans because your golden child refused to do it." I shot back, my voice remarkably steady, despite the adrenaline pounding in my ears. "I sacrificed my own space, my peace, and my time to serve this family when no one else would step up." My father slammed his hand on the table again, his face a mask of pure fury. "You are a guest in the house of the bishop," he roared, "and you have exactly 10 minutes to pack your miserable attitude and get off my property. I will not have my Christmas tainted by a jealous barren woman who cannot secure a husband or a legacy of her own. 10 minutes, Zuri, or I will have the church security team physically throw you onto the pavement." I stared at the man who shared my blood, seeing nothing but a hollow suit obsessed with respectability politics and public perception. There was no fatherly warmth in his eyes, only the cold, calculating glare of a chief executive protecting his brand. I did not waste another second trying to reason with a brick wall. I turned on my heel and sprinted up the grand, sweeping staircase toward the guest room. My mind raced as I pulled my small suitcase from the closet. I needed my work laptop. I needed the heavy wool coat I had just bought last week, because the Atlanta winter was proving to be unusually brutal this year. I grabbed the coat from the hanger and turned to sweep my laptop off the desk. Before my fingers could even brush the aluminum casing, the bedroom door flew open. My mother stood there. For a woman who claimed she could barely walk to the bathroom without my assistance yesterday, Corinne moved with terrifying speed and agility. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, ugly spite. She snatched the laptop right out from under my hand and yanked the winter coat from my other arm with surprising viciousness. "What are you doing?" I demanded, stepping forward to retrieve my property. "I paid for those. Those are my work tools and my clothes." My mother clutched the coat and laptop to her chest, her diamond rings flashing under the recessed lighting. "You bought these while living rent-free under our roof," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You have been eating our food, using our electricity, breathing our air. Everything you acquired while staying here is property of this house as compensation for your room and board. You leave with nothing." "Mom, it is freezing outside." I pleaded, the reality of the situation suddenly crashing down on me. "You cannot take my winter coat. You cannot take my laptop. My entire financial firm operates off that hard drive. You are actively trying to destroy my livelihood over a dinner table argument. You destroyed your own livelihood the second you disrespected Harrison," she spat back, her eyes narrowing with malice. "You think you are so smart with your numbers and your data. You think you are better than us because you rejected the church administration. Well, let us see how smart you are out on the street. You cannot do anything on your own anyway. You have always been a failure, Zuri. A bitter, empty failure who will never know what it means to be truly blessed." I reached for the coat again, but my father appeared in the doorway, blocking my path with his broad shoulders. He crossed his arms, looking at me as if I were a dangerous stranger who had broken in to steal the family silver. "Time is up," he said coldly. "Walk out the front door, or I call the police and tell them you are trespassing and physically harassing my recovering wife." The threat was absolute. I knew my father's vast influence in this city. A single phone call from Bishop Ezekiel would have me locked in a holding cell before midnight, and the local news would spin it exactly how he wanted. I backed away, my chest heaving, the bitter taste of ultimate betrayal burning the back of my throat. I turned to the bed. The only thing they had not claimed was an old battered leather messenger bag sitting on the mattress. It had belonged to my grandfather, Jeremiah. He had given it to me years ago, telling me it was my emergency bag, something to keep close when the world turned upside down. It was scuffed, worn at the edges, and looked entirely out of place in this pristine mansion. I grabbed the strap, throwing it over my shoulder. I walked past my parents without a single word. I walked down the sweeping staircase, past the roaring fireplace, past Iman and Harrison, who stood in the foyer watching me with identical sickening smirks of triumph. The heavy mahogany front door was pulled open by a member of the church security team. I stepped out onto the massive stone porch and the door slammed shut behind me with a loud final click. The deadbolt engaged immediately. The cold hit me instantly. It was a torrential, freezing Atlanta rain, the kind of wet cold that sinks straight into your bones and paralyzes your joints. I was wearing only a thin silk blouse and tailored slacks, no coat, no umbrella, no car keys. I had given my car to a valet service to have it detailed as a Christmas gift to myself, meaning I had absolutely no transportation and no way to seek shelter. I walked down the long, sweeping, perfectly manicured driveway, my expensive shoes sinking into the freezing puddles. Every step away from that mansion felt like tearing a physical piece of my heart out. These were the people who were supposed to protect me. These were the people who preached about unconditional love and grace to thousands of desperate congregants every Sunday. Yet they had just thrown their own daughter into a winter storm with absolutely nothing, simply because I dared to tell the truth about a predatory white developer who was using them to boost his real estate portfolio. I reached the end of the sprawling neighborhood and huddled under a small, rusted bus stop shelter. The wind howled through the open sides, whipping the icy rain against my exposed arms. I wrapped my arms around myself, my teeth chattering uncontrollably. I needed a plan. I needed shelter. I needed a phone to call a cab, but my parents had confiscated my personal cell phone, along with my laptop, claiming it was connected to their family data plan. I pulled my grandfather's battered leather bag into my lap, shielding it from the driving rain. My fingers were going numb. I fumbled with the brass buckles, praying that I had left a spare $20 bill, some loose change, or maybe an old prepaid transit card tucked inside the pockets. I dug my freezing fingers into the main compartment. Nothing. Just an old pen and a few crumpled grocery receipts. Panic began to claw at the edges of my mind. The temperature was dropping fast. I was truly stranded, entirely alone on Christmas Eve. Frustrated and shivering, I ran my hands along the inside lining of the bag. The fabric felt unusually thick, strangely stiff near the bottom panel. I pressed down and felt a hard rectangular shape concealed beneath the leather bottom. My heart leaped. I remembered Jeremiah always telling me to look deeper when things seemed empty. I dug my fingernails into the seam where the inner lining met the tough leather. The old stitching gave way with a sharp, ripping sound. I tore the fabric back, exposing a hidden, shallow compartment built directly into the base. I tipped the bag upside down. A heavy, solid black object fell out and landed right in the center of my shivering palms. It was not a $20 bill, it was a bank card. But it was not ordinary plastic. It was forged from solid titanium, sleek and completely unmarked, except for a gold microchip and my name, Zuri, embossed in subtle silver lettering across the bottom right corner. Stuck to the back of the heavy metal card was a small yellowed piece of paper. The adhesive was old and dry, but the handwriting was unmistakably the bold, sweeping script of my grandfather, Jeremiah. I squinted through the freezing rain, wiping away the water droplets to read the words he had left behind for me so many years ago. For my Zuri, for when the wolves take off their sheep's clothing. December 26th hit me like a solid sheet of ice. I woke up shivering violently on a mattress that felt like compressed cardboard inside a motel room that smelled of stale smoke and bleach. I had managed exactly 2 hours of sleep. My tailored silk blouse, the very same one Iman had nearly ripped the collar off just 36 hours ago, was hopelessly wrinkled and stained with rainwater. I had no winter coat. I had no personal cell phone. I had no car. but I had my razor-sharp mind, and I had my grandfather Jeremiah's battered leather emergency bag. I clutched the heavy titanium card in my pocket as I navigated the freezing Atlanta morning air. Vanguard Trust was located in the heart of the downtown financial district. It was a towering monolith of tinted glass and polished steel that catered exclusively to the ultra-wealthy. It was not a retail bank for standard checking accounts or simple mortgage applications. It was an elite institution designed for hiding generational wealth, managing offshore accounts, and protecting massive corporate empires. I knew this implicitly because I had spent my entire adult career working as a financial strategist, analyzing complex portfolios for clients who banked at places exactly like this. Walking through the heavy revolving doors, the sudden blast of heated air was a painful shock to my freezing system. The main lobby was architecturally designed to intimidate anyone who did not belong. Vaulted marble ceilings swallowed the sound of footsteps, the acoustics were heavily muffled, and armed security guards in tailored suits stood at strategic vantage points. I looked entirely out of place. I was a black woman shivering in a ruined silk blouse, clutching a scuffed leather bag to my chest. I could feel the harsh, judgmental stares of the elite clientele. I could see the silent calculations happening in their heads as they assessed my net worth based purely on my disheveled appearance. I completely ignored them. I marched straight toward the main teller counter, my heels clicking sharply and aggressively against the polished marble floor. I needed cash immediately. I figured Grandpa Jeremiah had maybe tucked away $2,000 or $3,000 on this emergency card. It would be just enough for a deposit on a new apartment, a cheap laptop to access my private servers, and a burner phone. It would be enough to get me back in the game so I could start tearing down Harrison's fraudulent real estate empire piece by piece. The teller was a young man with a crisp, expensive haircut and a patronizing smile. He looked at me like I had just wandered in off the rainy street to ask to use their private restroom. He asked how he could help me, his tone dripping with polished, rehearsed condescension. I did not say a single word to him. I simply reached into my damp pocket, pulled out the heavy titanium card, and slid it across the cold marble counter. The moment the solid metal hit the stone, it made a distinctive, heavy thud. The teller's patronizing smile faltered instantly. He picked up the card, turning it over in his hands with a look of profound confusion. There were no standard bank logos on the front. There were no customer service routing numbers on the back. There was only a thick gold microchip, and my name, Zuri, embossed in subtle silver lettering across the bottom right corner. He gave me a highly skeptical look before sliding the heavy metal card through his encrypted terminal. What happened next took exactly 4 seconds, but my trained eyes caught every single micro-expression that crossed his face. The teller looked down at his monitor. His eyes widened so far I thought they might actually pop out of his skull. All the color completely drained from his face in an instant, leaving his skin a chalky, sickly white. His hand dropped below the marble counter immediately, his fingers pressing hard against a hidden panel. I knew exactly what that movement meant. He had just triggered a silent alarm. Every muscle in my body instantly locked into a fighting position. I had spent 35 years dealing with Bishop Ezekiel's underhanded, ruthless tactics. My father was a man who wielded his social influence like a blunt weapon. He had the local police chief on speed dial. He played golf with influential city council members every single Sunday. I instantly assumed he had anticipated I would eventually find the emergency card hidden in the bag. He had probably called Vanguard Trust the exact second he threw me out into the rain, reporting the card stolen or flagging my name as a trespasser just to ensure my complete public humiliation. 2 security guards detached themselves from their posts near the main entrance. Their hands rested cautiously near their utility belts as they moved quickly and quietly toward my station at the counter. I squared my shoulders and planted my feet. I was not going to let them drag me out of this building without a massive fight. I started mentally compiling my legal rights, ready to demand an attorney, ready to scream the absolute truth about Harrison's predatory lending practices, right there in the pristine marble lobby. I set my jaw, waiting for the heavy hand of security to grab my arm and throw me out. But the guards did not grab me. Instead, the heavy, solid mahogany door located directly behind the teller line flew open so hard it rebounded violently off the wall. A man in his late 50s wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than my first car practically sprinted out of the restricted executive offices. He was sweating profusely, his face flushed a deep, panicked red, entirely ignoring the strict decorum of his own bank. He shoved past the terrified young teller and rushed around the marble counter, stepping directly between me and the advancing security guards. He held up a shaking hand to stop the guards in their tracks, then turned to me. His chest was heaving as if he had just run a full marathon. He was staring at me, not with suspicion, but with absolute, unadulterated terror. He gasped out my name, his voice cracking slightly under the immense pressure. He introduced himself as Arthur Caldwell, the regional branch manager. He apologized profusely for the wait and begged me to come with him immediately. He did not wait for my verbal confirmation. He extended his arm frantically and deferentially, ushering me away from the teller counter. He guided me past the heavy velvet ropes and away from the gaping stares of the wealthy clients in the lobby. I followed him, my analytical mind racing through 100 different complex financial scenarios, none of which made logical sense. A senior branch manager does not sweat profusely over a stolen card holding $2,000. A high-level executive does not abandon his secure post and personally escort a frozen, rumpled woman out of a public lobby unless the liability risk is absolutely astronomical. We bypassed the standard glass-walled executive suites completely. Caldwell led me down a secure, isolated corridor, swiping his own biometric security badge at 3 different heavily guarded checkpoints. We stopped at the very end of the hall in front of a massive, solid steel door embedded deep into the reinforced concrete wall. He placed his trembling hand on a biometric scanner, entered a complex 12-digit passcode, and the heavy door clicked open with a loud, pressurized hiss. We stepped into a windowless, soundproof vault room. Caldwell closed the door behind us, engaging the heavy internal deadbolt with a loud final clank that echoed sharply off the cold metal walls. The sterile room contained only a polished steel conference table, 2 leather chairs, and a highly secured computer terminal. Caldwell practically collapsed into one of the leather chairs. He pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his suit pocket and frantically wiped the heavy beads of sweat from his forehead. His hands were visibly shaking as he typed a rapid, complex sequence of commands into the encrypted keyboard. I stood towering over him, my mind demanding immediate answers. I dropped the shivering victim act entirely. I demanded to know exactly what was going on, warning him that if my father had contacted the bank to freeze my assets, there would be severe legal repercussions. Caldwell cut me off instantly, holding up both of his shaking hands in a desperate gesture of surrender. He swore that my father had absolutely no jurisdiction here. He promised that Ezekiel had no access to this specific terminal, and that no one in the world had access except me. He took a deep, shaky breath and swallowed hard as he looked up at me. "Ma, please sit down, you need to see this." I refused to sit. I leaned heavily over the cold steel table as Caldwell turned the encrypted monitor directly toward me. I locked my eyes on the bright screen, fully ready to calculate whatever modest hidden sum my grandfather had managed to stash away from the church's endlessly grasping hands. The numbers glowed a stark bright green against the black background of the secure financial dashboard. I read the digits once, then my eyes darted back to the beginning, and I read them again. The air violently rushed out of my lungs, leaving me entirely breathless. The heavy titanium card felt like it was physically burning a hole straight through my damp pocket. I braced my hands hard against the cold steel table to keep my trembling knees from buckling underneath me. My eyes tracked the impossible, unending string of zeros glowing on the monitor in front of my face. $42,450,000. The green digits burned themselves into my retinas. I blinked rapidly, certain my exhausted brain was hallucinating from the sheer trauma of the past 36 hours. I looked away from the monitor and stared at the polished steel wall of the vault, counting to 3 in my head. When I looked back, the numbers had not moved. They had not vanished. They sat there on the secure Vanguard Trust dashboard, tethered directly to my name. I turned to Arthur Caldwell. The branch manager was gripping the edges of his desk so hard his knuckles were stark white. He looked exactly like a man who had been sitting on a live grenade for a decade and was finally watching the pin drop. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice barely above a whisper. "I handed you a card for an emergency account. My grandfather was a hard-working man who ran a barbershop and a community center. He did not have $42 million sitting in liquid cash and real estate assets. There has to be a mistake in your system." "There is no mistake," Miss Zuri Caldwell replied, his voice trembling with a mixture of reverence and deep anxiety. "Jeremiah did not leave you a simple checking account. That titanium card you handed my teller is a cryptographic master key. It is the sole access point to a generation's skipping trust, legally registered as Jeremiah Holdings, LLC. You are looking at the combined valuation of the commercial deeds, the liquid investment portfolios, and the holding company assets. And as of midnight on your 35th birthday last week, you became the sole controlling manager of every single cent." I shook my head, my analytical mind struggling to process the monumental weight of his words. A generation-skipping trust. That meant Jeremiah had deliberately bypassed my mother and my father entirely. He had leapfrogged over Bishop Ezekiel and First Lady Corinne, intentionally denying them access to his accumulated wealth. I leaned closer to the glowing monitor, my eyes scanning the itemized list of commercial deeds held under the LLC. The inventory read like a map of my childhood neighborhood. The community center was there. The historic barbershop was there. But as I scrolled further down the encrypted list, my heart slammed against my ribs. "Caldwell," I said, pointing a shaking finger at a specific block of parcel identification numbers. "Tell me I am reading this incorrectly. Tell me these parcel numbers do not correspond to the exact latitude and longitude of my father's church." Caldwell swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing above his tight collar. "You are reading it perfectly. Jeremiah Holdings, LLC, owns the commercial deeds to the entire historic block. That includes the land directly beneath Bishop Ezekiel's 20,000-seat megachurch. It includes the land beneath the broadcast center. It includes the ground beneath the executive parsonage. Your grandfather leased the land to the church organization on a 30-year agreement for $1 a year. But the deed, the actual ownership of the soil they stand on, belongs exclusively to you. You are your father's landlord." The sheer magnitude of my grandfather's brilliance hit me with the force of a physical blow. Jeremiah was a man who wore faded overalls and spent his weekends sweeping the floors of the community center. But beneath that humble exterior was a financial mastermind who saw the future with terrifying clarity. He knew my parents were fundamentally hollow. He knew they were utterly obsessed with respectability politics, completely intoxicated by their proximity to white wealth and high society validation. He knew they viewed our historic working-class black neighborhood as a dirty stepping stone, a place to be paved over and gentrified the second they secured enough power. Jeremiah had seen right through my mother's country club aspirations and my father's televised vanity. And more importantly, he had recognized my defiant streak. While Iman spent her childhood learning how to smile for the church cameras and parrot my mother's elitist talking points, I was the one arguing at the dinner table. I was the one who refused to join the church administration, choosing instead to study corporate finance and data strategy. Jeremiah knew my parents would eventually sell our heritage for a seat at a table that did not want them. So he weaponized my independence. He hid the real power in the hands of the only granddaughter who possessed the backbone to fight back. A sudden sharp electronic blare shattered the dead silence of the vault. I jumped back from the desk as the entire encrypted dashboard flashed a violent, aggressive red. A large warning banner dropped across the top of the monitor, covering the multi-million-dollar balance with blinking alert symbols. The sudden noise made Caldwell curse under his breath. His hands flew across the keyboard, typing a frantic sequence of override commands to silence the piercing alarm. "What is happening?" I demanded, my financial instincts immediately overriding my shock. "Is someone trying to breach the account?" Caldwell's face grew incredibly grim. He adjusted his glasses and leaned into the monitor, pulling up a highly classified security log. Miss Zuri, he began, his tone dropping into a grave professional cadence. This red alert has been active on your profile for the past 6 months. Our fraud division has been fighting a relentless, sophisticated shadow campaign attempting to infiltrate Jeremiah Holdings LLC. Someone has been aggressively trying to illegally borrow against your prime real estate assets. Borrow against my assets. I repeated, my voice sharpening into a blade. I have never authorized a single loan. I did not even know this account existed until 10 minutes ago. How can anyone borrow against deeds locked in a generation-skipping trust? They have been submitting forged power of attorney documents, Caldwell explained, pulling up a series of scanned PDF files on the screen. The perpetrators have filed dozens of legal requests, claiming that you are medically incapacitated, psychologically unstable, or entirely unreachable. They have been trying to use these forged documents to secure massive commercial loans, using the land beneath your father's church as the primary collateral. We flagged the initial requests because the trust explicitly requires the physical presence of the titanium card to authorize any leveraging of assets. But the entity submitting these requests has been growing incredibly desperate. They escalated their tactics last week. I slammed my hands down on the polished steel table. Show me the entity, Caldwell. Show me exactly who has the sheer audacity to attempt corporate espionage against Vanguard Trust. Caldwell did not hesitate. He executed a trace protocol overriding the digital mask on the incoming IP address. He pulled up the corporate filing of the offending entity, stripping away the shell company layers until the true parent organization was displayed in stark black and white text. The name hit the screen, and the air in the vault instantly turned to ice. Harrison Development Group. I stared at the name of my brother-in-law's company. The pieces of the puzzle violently snapped together in my mind. Harrison did not want to tear down the community center to build a shiny new parking pavilion for the church. That was a pathetic, transparent cover story. His conglomerate was hemorrhaging cash. I had seen the public records, but the reality was clearly far more disastrous than I had calculated. Harrison was facing total insolvency. He was trying to steal my grandfather's land, a property valued at over $40 million, to leverage a massive corporate bailout and avoid a catastrophic bankruptcy. He needed the deeds to save himself from federal prison for defrauding his previous investors. But my analytical mind caught a massive flaw in his plan. Harrison was a legal outsider. He was a white developer who had married into the family. He could not forge medical power of attorney documents completely on his own. Vanguard Trust had rigorous security protocols. To claim medical incapacitation of a primary account holder, the bank legally required the sworn notarized corroboration of an immediate blood relative. Harrison could never bypass that failsafe without inside help. He had an accomplice, I said, my voice echoing coldly off the steel walls of the vault. He needed a blood relative to sign off on the medical incapacitation forms. Show me the signature page of the most recent fraudulent loan application. Caldwell clicked a button, bringing up a high-resolution scan of a legal affidavit dated just 2 days before Christmas. The document formally declared Zuri Ezekiel as mentally unfit to manage her own financial affairs, transferring temporary conservatorship of Jeremiah Holdings, LLC, to the Harrison Development Group. I scrolled down to the bottom of the page. Right there below the forged notary stamp sat the secondary authorization. It was written in crisp, unmistakable blue ink. I recognized the precise, elegant loop of the capital letter immediately. It was a signature I had seen on birthday cards, church programs, and family portraits my entire life. It was the signature of my holy, perfect golden child sister. Iman had sold me out. She had actively conspired to declare me medically insane just to steal our grandfather's fortune and save her husband's crumbling empire. Iman's signature burned itself into my memory. The very sister who had stood beside our parents while they threw me out into a freezing rainstorm was actively committing a federal felony to rob me blind. The initial shock evaporated instantly, replaced by a glacial, calculated rage. Caldwell watched me from across the polished steel table, his hands still trembling over the encrypted keyboard. He explained that my grandfather Jeremiah had not left me a simple savings account or a modest emergency fund. He had left me full controlling interest in Jeremiah Holdings, LLC. That entity was the parent company that held the commercial deeds to the entire historic block. It included the land directly beneath Bishop Ezekiel's massive 20,000-seat megachurch. The total valuation sat at an astounding $42 million. My grandfather had known exactly what he was doing. He knew my parents would eventually squander the community's generational wealth for respectability politics. He knew they were utterly intoxicated by their proximity to high society validation and would gladly pave over our history for a seat at a table that did not want them. So he weaponized my independence. He hid the real power in the hands of the only granddaughter who possessed the backbone to fight back. The trust had been legally sealed until my 35th birthday, activated only by the physical titanium card he had hidden in the lining of his old emergency bag. I looked up from the monitor. Caldwell was watching me, waiting for the inevitable explosion. There was no explosion, just pure, focused execution. Caldwell pointed a shaking finger at the flashing red alert on the account dashboard. He informed me that someone had been trying to illegally borrow against these deeds for the past 6 months. They had been submitting forged power of attorney documents claiming I was medically incapacitated. I instructed Caldwell to freeze all pending requests from Harrison Development Group immediately and place a hard lock on the trust. Then I authorized a wire transfer of $500,000 into a newly established, highly secure private checking account. I needed operating capital, and I needed it 5 minutes ago. Caldwell processed the transfer with terrified efficiency, handing me a sleek black debit card linked directly to the new funds. I walked out of Vanguard Trust, a completely different woman than the one who had walked in. My first call was to a private car service. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb within minutes, whisking me away from the financial district. My second call was to Valerie Sterling. Valerie was a corporate litigator I had crossed paths with during my tenure at a top-tier financial strategy firm. She was a notorious shark in Atlanta legal circles, a woman who ate arrogant developers for breakfast and billed them for the privilege. I gave her a 60-second summary of the forged medical power of attorney, the $42 million generational trust, and the impending illegal foreclosure. She canceled her entire afternoon schedule immediately. I checked into the penthouse suite at the St. Regis in Buckhead. The sprawling, opulent room became my war room. While Valerie drafted the emergency injunctions and cease and desist orders, I handled my physical transformation. I tossed the ruined, rain-stained silk blouse and slacks directly into the trash. A personal shopper delivered a curated selection of tailored garments to my suite within 2 hours. I selected a razor-sharp charcoal gray suit, a crisp white silk top, and a structured black designer trench coat that practically radiated authority. I slid my feet into a pair of black leather stilettos that felt like armor. I was no longer the designated beast of burden for the Ezekiel family. I was the chief executive of Jeremiah Holdings, and I was going to war. I purchased a top-of-the-line encrypted laptop and a burner phone, immediately establishing a secure connection to my private servers. At 7 o'clock the next morning, my new phone buzzed with an alert I had set up through the city's municipal permit database. Harrison had just logged an emergency demolition notice for the historic block. He was moving with terrifying speed. Assuming I was currently sleeping on a park bench and entirely disconnected from the digital world, he was trying to tear down the community center before the bank even officially processed his fraudulent loan. Caldwell had pulled up the IP address and the corporate filings yesterday, confirming exactly what Harrison was attempting to do. He was not building a parking lot for the church. He was trying to steal the land to cover a massive looming corporate bankruptcy. He needed to clear the ground and break ground on his luxury condominiums to appease his frantic creditors. I grabbed the freshly printed legal documents Valerie had couriered over, slid my dark sunglasses onto my face, and headed downstairs to the waiting black SUV. We drove straight to the historic district. As the SUV turned the corner, the destruction was already underway. Two massive yellow bulldozers were idling near the community center parking lot. A crew of workers in hard hats and neon safety vests were erecting a chain-link perimeter fence. Harrison was completely bypassing standard safety protocols, rushing the job out of pure, unadulterated desperation. I told my driver to pull the SUV directly across the main entrance of the parking lot, completely blocking the path of an incoming dump truck. The driver hit the brakes. I pushed open the heavy door and stepped out onto the cracked pavement. The biting winter wind whipped the hem of my trench coat around my legs as I marched straight toward the site foreman. He was a burly man, holding a clipboard, shouting orders at the bulldozer operators. He turned as I approached, looking irritated by the interruption. I did not give him a chance to speak. I thrust the heavy stack of legal documents directly against his chest. I informed him that he was standing on private property owned by Jeremiah Holdings, LLC, and that he had exactly 2 minutes to shut off his heavy machinery, or I would have him and his entire crew arrested for criminal trespassing and illegal demolition. The foreman looked at the official court seal on the cease and desist order, then looked at my designer suit and the waiting chauffeured SUV. He recognized genuine power when he saw it. He immediately raised his radio and signaled the operators to cut their engines. The roaring diesel motors ground to a halt, leaving a sudden ringing silence over the lot. The foreman pulled out his cell phone and dialed his boss. 10 minutes later, a silver Porsche Panamera came careening around the corner, taking the turn so fast the tires squealed violently against the asphalt. The car jerked to a halt inches from my SUV. Harrison threw open the driver's side door and stormed out. He was dressed in his typical uniform of casual wealth, an expensive cashmere sweater and tailored slacks, but his face was an ugly, mottled red. He marched toward me completely dripping with white privilege and unearned arrogance. He had married into a powerful black church to exploit its congregation, and he looked at me with absolute contempt. He pointed a finger directly at my face, shouting loud enough for the entire construction crew to hear. He called me a bitter, crazy woman. He demanded to know what I was doing harassing his workers. He explicitly told me that my father had thrown me out on the street for being mentally unstable and ordered me to get off his property immediately before he called the police and had me thrown into a psychiatric hold. He stood inches from my face, trying to use his height and his volume to physically intimidate me into backing down. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I stood perfectly still, letting his pathetic tantrum run its course. When he finally stopped shouting to catch his breath, I smiled, adjusting my sunglasses. "You are trespassing on my property, Harrison. And by the way, your forged loan application at Vanguard Trust just got flagged by federal investigators." All the color drained from Harrison's face. The absolute terror that washed over Harrison's face was worth every single moment of suffering I had endured over the past 2 days. His carefully constructed mask of unearned arrogance shattered into a million pieces right there on the cracked asphalt. He opened his mouth to scream another threat, but no sound came out. The realization that he was no longer dealing with a compliant, bullied family member, but rather a fully armed corporate adversary, paralyzed him entirely. He was a man accustomed to wielding his white privilege and his father-in-law's religious influence as an impenetrable shield against any real consequences. But Vanguard Trust did not care about local church politics. Federal investigators did not care who he played golf with on Sunday afternoons. They only cared about wire fraud, forged signatures, and the illegal leveraging of a $42 million holding company. He took a frantic, stumbling step backward, nearly tripping over the heavy tread of a bulldozer track. He looked wildly around the demolition site, as if expecting the FBI to descend from the sky at that very second. He fumbled blindly for his car keys, his hands shaking so violently he dropped them straight into the dirt. He scooped them up, practically dove into his silver Porsche, and peeled out of the parking lot, leaving a thick cloud of exhaust fumes and a crew of highly confused construction workers in his wake. I knew exactly where he was heading. He was running back to the sprawling suburban mansion to hide behind Bishop Ezekiel's ecclesiastical robes. I turned my back on the dust and the silence pulling my black designer trench coat tighter against the biting winter wind. I slid back into the rich leather seat of my chauffeured SUV and instructed the driver to return to the St. Regis in Buckhead. As the vehicle merged into the heavy Atlanta traffic, I dialed Valerie Sterling. My newly retained corporate litigator confirmed that the cease and desist orders had been formally filed with the City Planning Commission, and the bank's internal fraud division was already pulling the high-definition surveillance footage of Harrison presenting the forged documents. The trap was set, and the first rat had already triggered the wire. The lobby of the St. Regis was a sanctuary of hushed generational wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the immaculate marble floors. A pianist played a soft classical sonata in the corner lounge, while wealthy patrons engaged in quiet, polite conversations over tiered trays of expensive high tea. It was an environment specifically designed to keep chaos out. I took a seat in a plush velvet wingback chair near the grand staircase, ordering a sparkling water while I reviewed the digital holding structures on my new encrypted laptop. I felt entirely in control. I was no longer fighting for scraps of basic respect in my childhood bedroom. I was commanding a financial empire from a luxury fortress. But I had severely underestimated the sheer unhinged desperation of a narcissist losing control. 3 hours later, the heavy glass revolving doors at the front entrance spun with violent force. My mother, First Lady Corinne, burst into the pristine hotel lobby, looking like a hurricane contained within a tailored St. John knit suit. She had clearly abandoned her driver, leaving her own luxury sedan parked hazardously in the valet lane. Her signature pearl necklace bounced erratically against her chest, and her perfectly coiffed hair was visibly frayed from the storm outside. She completely ignored the refined decorum she had spent her entire adult life preaching to her congregation. She marched across the marble floor, her heels striking the stone like rapid gunfire, her eyes scanning the room with manic intensity. She spotted me sitting calmly in the velvet chair. The sheer rage contorting her features made her look entirely unrecognizable. She was a woman accustomed to a daughter who shrank under her constant, heavy disapproval. She expected to find the broken, humiliated woman she had thrown out into a freezing rainstorm with absolutely nothing. She was fundamentally unprepared for the woman sitting before her draped in expensive tailoring and radiating absolute chilling authority. "You ungrateful, wicked girl!" she hissed, her voice rising to a shrill, carrying crescendo that caused several wealthy patrons to turn their heads in shock. She stood directly over me, her entire body trembling with absolute fury. "You have gone completely out of your mind. Harrison just walked into my home shaking like a leaf. He is expanding our ministry. He is doing important work for this city, and you are terrorizing him. You are actively trying to destroy your sister's husband out of pure, bitter jealousy." I did not break eye contact. I did not raise my voice. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water before setting the crystal glass onto the coaster. I told her that Harrison was a common criminal, attempting to steal land that did not belong to him. Corinne's face flushed a deep, dangerous crimson. "You call off this ridiculous legal stunt right now, Zuri," she commanded, using her booming pulpit voice. "You call that bank and you tell them you made a mistake. You fix this immediately, or I swear to God, I will destroy you." I slowly stood up, smoothing the front of my charcoal suit. I towered over her, maintaining a cold, unbothered silence. My absolute refusal to cower pushed her entirely over the edge. Her illusion of absolute control shattered. In a blind flash of maternal rage, Corinne pulled her right arm back and swung her hand toward my face, aiming a vicious, open-palmed slap directly at my cheek right in front of the horrified concierge staff. My hand shot up with lightning speed. I caught her wrist firmly in midair, stopping her violent strike dead in its tracks. The impact sent a sharp sting through my palm, and her heavy diamond rings dug painfully into my skin, but I did not flinch. I held her arm suspended rigidly between us. My grip tightened around her fragile wrist, just enough to let her know she was completely physically powerless against me. "Do not ever try to put your hands on me again," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register that cut right through her hysteria. "You have been trying to slap me down since I was 10 years old. You have resented me my entire life, simply because I carry Jeremiah's dark skin and his absolute defiance, while your golden child Iman got your light skin and your pathetic obsession with white validation. Corinne gasped, trying to wrench her arm away, but I held fast. I leaned in closer, ensuring she heard every single word. You spent your whole life bending over backward to make these predatory developers and politicians like you. I continued, my voice dripping with pure disgust. You thought proximity to their power made you special. But Jeremiah knew exactly what you were. He knew you would gladly sell out our heritage, our history, and our entire community just to secure a membership at a country club that secretly despises you. He knew you would squander our generational wealth for respectability politics, so he hid the real power with the only granddaughter who possessed the backbone to protect it. I released her wrist with a sharp, dismissive shove. She stumbled back a step, her chest heaving as she rubbed her arm. The truth hit her with devastating accuracy, but her desperate need to protect her fabricated reality immediately fought back against the facts. She was completely unglued, shaking with a rage that bordered on actual madness. You know absolutely nothing about sacrifice, she screamed, entirely abandoning any remaining pretense of public dignity. The pianist in the lounge abruptly stopped playing. Two hotel security guards were slowly approaching from the main desk, clearly unsure of how to handle a prominent religious figure having a highly visible public meltdown. You are destroying the empire we built! Corinne shrieked, her voice echoing wildly off the vaulted marble ceiling. We gave our blood for that church. We gave our entire lives to build a legacy, and you are tearing it down because you want to play a real estate mogul. You have no idea what is actually at stake here. You have no idea what you are ruining. I know exactly what is at stake. I shot back, my tone razor sharp and devoid of any sympathy. Harrison is entirely bankrupt. He is a fraud. He forged my signature to steal $42 million of my land to save his own miserable skin, and you helped him do it. You conspired to declare your own daughter mentally incompetent just to cover his massive debts. We had to let him leverage the church. Corinne shrieked, her face twisting into a mask of absolute blind panic. The words tore violently out of her throat before her panicked brain could stop them. He promised to pay off the $2 million Iman owes the Internal Revenue Service. A dead, heavy silence instantly fell over our entire corner of the lobby. The only sound was the distant hum of the revolving doors. Corinne frantically clapped both of her hands over her mouth, her eyes stretching wide with sudden horrifying realization of what she had just confessed in a room full of highly attentive witnesses. She had just admitted to a massive federal crime. I slowly lowered my dark sunglasses, staring at the terrified woman who had birthed me. A cold, predatory smirk spread across my face as the beautiful, chaotic truth washed over me. My perfect, holy, social media-obsessed sister was not just an accomplice to corporate bank fraud. She was actively facing federal tax evasion. The high-definition glow of my laptop screen cast long, harsh shadows across the walls of my hotel suite. I sat perfectly still in the plush velvet armchair, watching the live Sunday broadcast of Greater Grace Cathedral. The camera panned across a sea of 5,000 congregants, their faces enraptured, their hands raised in devoted worship. The massive choir swelled to a triumphant crescendo before fading into a hushed, reverent silence. Bishop Ezekiel strode to the center of the polished oak stage. He wore a stunning, custom-tailored crimson robe that commanded absolute authority. He gripped the edges of the clear acrylic pulpit, bowing his head for a long, dramatic moment before looking up at the crowd. His face was a mask of profound, manufactured sorrow. There is a spirit of betrayal moving through the house of the Lord this morning. He began, his booming baritone echoing through the massive sanctuary and vibrating through my laptop speakers. We work our entire lives to build a legacy. We sacrifice our blood, our sweat, and our tears to uplift our community and provide a sanctuary for the righteous. But the enemy does not attack from the outside. The enemy works from within. The enemy uses the people closest to you to tear down the walls of the temple. He stepped out from behind the pulpit, pacing the stage with heavy, deliberate steps. A low murmur of agreement rippled through the congregation. He was working them into a frenzy, expertly plucking at their emotions like a master musician. "I am talking about the Jezebel spirit," he roared, his voice suddenly echoing like thunder. "I am talking about ungrateful, covetous daughters who look at what their elders have built and decide they want to steal it for themselves. I am talking about a generation that has lost all respect for authority, a generation that uses secular worldly tactics to attack the anointed leaders of their own family. They will smile in your face while plotting to take the very ground you stand on. But the Lord says, 'Touch not my anointed.'" The congregation erupted into a chorus of amens and hallelujahs. The camera cut to the front row. My mother, First Lady Corinne, was sitting in her usual seat of honor. She held a lace handkerchief to her face, her shoulders shaking with perfectly timed theatrical sobs. The camera lingered on her grief, broadcasting her performance to hundreds of thousands of viewers streaming the service online. My father was not just preaching a sermon, he was launching a highly coordinated, vicious smear campaign. He was weaponizing respectability politics, using his massive platform to turn the entire city against me without ever explicitly saying my name. He was painting himself as the tragic, persecuted patriarch and branding me as a greedy, unstable traitor who was trying to destroy a beloved community institution. Before the broadcast even ended, my personal phone began to vibrate violently against the glass coffee table. It was a relentless, unceasing barrage of notifications. The notifications blurred together into a continuous stream of pure hostility. Aunt Martha texted me to say I was an absolute disgrace to the Ezekiel name and a stain on my grandfather's memory. My cousin David sent a voice note calling me a bitter, jealous woman who was trying to ruin Iman's marriage out of pure spite. Deacons and church elders I had known since childhood flooded my inbox with messages demanding I publicly repent for my wicked actions and return the property to the church immediately. They had all swallowed my father's narrative whole. I watched the hateful messages roll in my chest, tightening with a cold, suffocating pressure. I had spent my entire life trying to exist outside the blast radius of my parents' narcissism. I had moved downtown, built my own business, and asked them for absolutely nothing. Yet, with a single 20-minute sermon, my father had successfully mobilized thousands of people to view me as a complete pariah. Then my business line rang. The caller ID displayed the name of Marcus Vance. Marcus was the CEO of a prominent Atlanta tech firm and one of the largest corporate clients in my financial strategy portfolio. I took a steadying breath and answered the call with my usual crisp professionalism. "Zuri, we have a problem," Marcus said. His tone was rigid and uncharacteristically cold. "I just got off a conference call with my board of directors. 3 of my senior vice presidents are sitting in the pews at Greater Grace right now. My phone has been blowing up all morning with some very disturbing rumors regarding your current legal disputes with the church administration. Marcus, those are fabricated rumors designed to cover up an ongoing federal investigation into fraudulent loan applications submitted by Harrison Development Group," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I can provide full documentation of the forgery." "I do not care about the documentation," Marcus interrupted sharply. "I care about optics. Atlanta is a massive city, but the corporate circles are incredibly small and highly intertwined with your father's congregation. My board members are threatening to walk if I keep you on retainer. They view you as a massive liability. Our corporate contracts contain strict moral clauses regarding public scandals. Effective immediately, we are terminating our consulting agreement." The line went dead before I could say another word. I slowly lowered the phone, the sheer weight of my family's social and economic power finally crashing down on my shoulders. Bishop Ezekiel was not just trying to embarrass me. He was actively destroying my livelihood. He was starving me out, cutting off my income stream so I would be forced to surrender my grandfather's deeds just to survive. The walls of the luxurious hotel suite suddenly felt like they were closing in. The reality of fighting a $40 million legal war against a man who practically owned the city began to suffocate me. "You are letting them get in your head." I looked up. Valerie Sterling was sitting perfectly still on the velvet sofa opposite me. My ruthless corporate litigator had let herself into the suite using the spare keycard I had provided. She wore a pristine ivory pantsuit that looked sharp enough to draw blood. She was calmly sipping a cup of black coffee from room service, watching me with calculating hawk-like eyes. "He just cost me a major corporate contract," I said, gesturing to my phone. "He just turned my entire extended family and 5,000 congregants against me. He is burning my reputation to the ground." Valerie gently set her coffee cup down on the saucer. Her expression did not change. She looked entirely bored by my father's tactics. "Zuri, you are a brilliant financial strategist, but you are failing to read the psychology of the boardroom," Valerie said, her voice crisp and devoid of any pity. "Your father is a narcissist, losing his absolute control over a major asset. He is bleeding out. He knows the federal investigators have already flagged Vanguard Trust. He knows we filed the cease and desist orders yesterday. That entire theatrical sermon was a desperate smokescreen. A cornered animal bites the hardest right before it bleeds out. He is making loud noises in public because he is terrified of the silence behind closed doors. Do not let the theatrics distract you from the numbers." Before I could respond to her assessment, a sudden frantic pounding echoed through the suite. Someone was hammering violently against the heavy oak door of my room. The knocking was erratic and desperate. I frowned, glancing at Valerie. She simply crossed her legs and took another sip of her coffee, gesturing for me to answer it. I walked across the suite and pulled open the heavy door. My sister Iman stumbled into the room. The sight of her was entirely jarring. Iman was a woman who practically lived in front of a ring light. She spent her entire existence curating a flawless, faithful high society aesthetic for her millions of social media followers. She never left the house without perfect makeup, a fresh blowout, and a designer outfit. The woman standing in front of me looked like she had just survived a car crash. Her expensive silk blouse was wrinkled and untucked. Her hair was pulled back in a messy, chaotic knot. Dark streaks of ruined mascara ran down her cheeks, staining her pale skin. She was completely alone, shivering uncontrollably, despite the warm air of the hotel corridor. "Zuri, please." Iman gasped out, her chest heaving as she collapsed against the entryway wall. She buried her face in her hands, letting out a wretched, ugly sob. "You have to stop this. You have to call your lawyers off right now. You are going to ruin my entire life." I crossed my arms over my chest, staring down at the sister who had happily watched my father throw me into a freezing rainstorm just 4 days ago. I stared at the woman who had forged my signature on a federal banking document to declare me medically insane. "You committed a felony, Iman?" I said, my voice dropping to a glacial temperature. "You forged a medical power of attorney. You tried to steal $42 million of Jeremiah's land." Iman shook her head violently, tears flying from her face. She reached out with trembling hands, trying to grab the sleeve of my trench coat. I stepped back, refusing to let her touch me. "I had to do it," she wept, dropping to her knees right there on the plush hotel carpet. She looked up at me, playing the ultimate desperate victim. "Harrison forced me. He said we were going to lose the house. He said the investors were going to take everything we own. You have to sign the deeds over to him, Zuri. You have to let him have the land. If you do not give him the church property, he is going to divorce me. He is going to leave me with absolutely nothing. Please, you cannot do this to me." I looked down at the golden child of the Ezekiel family groveling on the floor of my hotel suite. She was begging me to save her fraudulent marriage. She was crying over her husband's impending bankruptcy. She had absolutely no idea that I already knew the real reason she was terrified. I slowly pulled off my dark sunglasses and looked her dead in the eyes. I let a slow, cruel smirk spread across my face. "Harrison isn't going to leave you because of his bankruptcy, Iman. He is going to leave you because you owe the Internal Revenue Service $2 million in unpaid back taxes." The desperate sobbing instantly stopped. Iman froze on the floor, her tear-filled eyes blowing wide with absolute paralyzing horror. I stared at the heavy oak door of my hotel suite as the frantic, uneven knocking echoed through the room. The sound was a stark contrast to the quiet, insulated luxury of the St. Regis. I had just spent the last hour watching my father publicly assassinate my character on a global live stream and fielding calls from terrified clients jumping ship. My patience was entirely non-existent. I unbolted the lock and pulled the door open. Iman stood in the hallway looking completely unhinged. She was alone. Her chest heaved with violent theatrical sobs. The flawless, curated aesthetic she meticulously maintained for her millions of social media followers had completely vanished. Her designer trench coat hung open. Her hair was a tangled mess, and her usually pristine makeup was ruined by streaks of heavy, dark tears. She looked exactly like a woman whose entire fraudulent empire was collapsing around her. Before I could even speak, she pushed past me, stumbling into the foyer of the suite and burying her face in her manicured hands. "Zuri, please," she wailed, her voice cracking as she collapsed onto the velvet sofa in the center of my makeshift war room. "You have to listen to me. You have to stop this right now. You do not understand what is happening behind closed doors. You are going to ruin my entire life." I closed the suite door until the lock clicked securely into place. I did not offer her a glass of water. I did not offer her a tissue. I simply crossed my arms over my chest and watched her perform. Iman had spent 35 years perfecting the art of playing the helpless, persecuted victim. It was the exact same routine she used when we were teenagers, the exact same routine that always guaranteed our parents would rush to her defense and punish me for her mistakes. "Harrison is going to leave me," she wept, rocking back and forth on the expensive upholstery. "He is completely frantic. His creditors are calling the house at all hours of the night. If he does not secure that loan by Friday, they are going to seize our personal assets. They are going to take the cars, the house, everything. He told me that if I do not get you to release those deeds, he is filing for divorce. He will leave me with absolutely nothing, Zuri. You cannot let him do this to me." I remained standing near the mahogany desk, my posture rigid and unyielding. "You committed a federal felony, Aman," I said, my voice dropping to a cold clinical register. "You forged a medical power of attorney. You legally declared your own sister mentally incompetent to steal a $42 million generational trust. You did not do that because you are a victim. You did it because you owe the IRS $2 million in unpaid back taxes, and you were desperate to cover your tracks." Iman shook her head violently, squeezing her eyes shut, as fresh tears poured down her cheeks. "I had to do it. You do not understand the pressure I am under. Everyone expects me to be perfect. Everyone expects me to be the flawless daughter of Bishop Ezekiel. I was drowning. But you have to sign the deeds over to him now, Zuri. You just have to." She paused, taking a ragged, shuddering breath. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and swimming with manufactured terror. She played her ultimate card. "I am pregnant." The words hung in the dead silence of the hotel suite. "Please, Zuri," she begged, her voice dropping into a fragile, broken whisper. "I am 2 months pregnant. If Harrison leaves me, I will have to raise this baby completely alone in the middle of a massive public scandal. Our father will never forgive me for bringing shame to the church. I will be ruined. You cannot do this to your own niece or nephew. You have the power to fix all of this. Just transfer the deeds to my name. For the baby. Please, do it for the baby." My analytical mind immediately went to work, dissecting the absolute absurdity of her claim. I watched her posture, her breathing, the specific way she held her stomach. It was a flawless, terrifyingly convincing performance. Any normal person would have folded immediately under the sheer emotional weight of a pregnant sister begging for her life. But I was not a normal person, and I knew exactly who my sister was. As she continued to weep and plead, she slowly stood up from the sofa. She began to pace the room, her movements erratic and supposedly fueled by overwhelming panic. She took a step toward the window, then a step toward the seating area, subtly inching her way across the expensive rug. She was moving directly toward the mahogany desk where my encrypted laptop sat open. The screen was brightly illuminated, displaying the highly classified Vanguard Trust Security dashboard. Valerie and I had been running override protocols, attempting to trace the exact routing numbers Harrison had used for his fraudulent loan applications. The master access port was currently unlocked. I did not move a muscle. I simply tracked her with my eyes. Iman let out another gut-wrenching sob, doubling over, as if the emotional distress was causing her physical pain. She stumbled forward, bracing her left hand heavily against the edge of the mahogany desk to support her weight. But I was watching her right hand. Hidden behind the oversized leather flap of her designer handbag, her fingers were moving with practiced, silent precision. She subtly pulled a small silver USB drive from the inner pocket. While she wailed about her unborn child and her crumbling marriage, she expertly slid her hand toward the open port on the side of my laptop. She was trying to deploy a digital siphon to steal the Vanguard access codes and bypass the bank's internal security lockdown. My reaction was instantaneous. I lunged forward with explosive speed and slammed the heavy metal lid of the laptop shut. The sharp, violent crack of metal hitting metal echoed like a gunshot through the suite. The screen slammed down, trapping the silver USB drive against the keyboard and violently grazing Iman's fingers in the process. Iman shrieked and yanked her hand back, clutching her bruised fingers against her chest. The transformation was absolute and terrifying. The tears vanished instantly. The trembling, fragile posture evaporated into thin air. The sweet, weeping facade dropped so fast, it was as if she had flipped a mechanical switch. Iman stood up perfectly straight, her shoulders squared and her jaw set. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. She looked at the trapped USB drive, then looked directly into my eyes. She did not look sorry. She looked like a predator that had just missed its kill. "You always were a paranoid, overly analytical freak," Iman snarled, her voice dropping its high-pitched panic and settling into a cruel, mocking sneer. I slowly pulled the USB drive from the crushed port and tossed it directly into the trash can beside the desk. "You are not pregnant, Iman. And you are definitely not a victim. You are just a pathetic thief who got caught." Iman threw her head back and let out a harsh, echoing laugh. It was a sound completely devoid of any warmth or humanity. It was the laugh of a woman who had spent her entire life stepping on the necks of everyone around her and thoroughly enjoying the view. "You think you are so smart sitting up here in your luxury suite playing corporate mastermind?" she mocked, stepping closer until she was inches from my face. "You think you hold all the cards just because Jeremiah gave you a piece of plastic? You are nothing, Zuri. You are a 35-year-old barren loser who could not even keep a man, let alone build a real family. You have no one and you have nothing." Her words were designed to hit my deepest, most guarded insecurities. But I stared back at her with eyes like glacial ice. Her insults meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. Harrison is not some local contractor you can bully with a cease and desist order. Iman continued, her tone dripping with toxic arrogance. "His investors are billionaires. They are ruthless, untouchable men who own half the politicians in this state. They do not care about your little legal injunctions. They will crush you and your boutique law firm by Friday. They will bury you under so much litigation, you will not be able to afford a cup of coffee." "They cannot touch the land without my authorization," I replied coldly. "The trust requires my physical presence and my signature. Vanguard has already locked the accounts." "You failed." Iman smiled. It was a terrible, venomous expression. "You really think Harrison and I acted alone?" she whispered, leaning in closer. "You really think a bank like Vanguard would accept a medical power of attorney just because I signed it? They required a secondary overriding authorization from the highest-ranking member of the immediate family. They required the signature of someone with unimpeachable public standing and absolute moral authority." The air in the room suddenly turned freezing cold as the reality of her words began to click into place in my mind. "Dad already signed the override clause." Iman revealed, her eyes gleaming with dark, triumphant satisfaction. "Bishop Ezekiel legally swore under oath that you are mentally unfit to manage your own affairs." He handed the conservatorship directly to Harrison. "He authorized the leveraging of the church land himself. You own nothing, Zuri. Your own father sold you out to save my lifestyle." She grabbed her designer bag, turning on her heel with a sharp, dismissive pivot. She marched toward the door, entirely unbothered by the trail of destruction she was leaving in her wake. "Enjoy your empty hotel room," she called out over her shoulder, grabbing the brass handle. "Because by next week, Harrison's bulldozers are going to pave over Jeremiah's legacy, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop it." The heavy oak door slammed shut behind her, leaving me standing alone in the deafening silence of the suite. My heart pounded against my ribs like a war drum. My hands balled into tight, white-knuckled fists at my sides. Iman thought she had just delivered the killing blow. She thought she had broken my spirit by revealing the ultimate depths of my father's betrayal. She thought knowing that Bishop Ezekiel had orchestrated the forgery himself would make me surrender. She was wrong. She had not broken my spirit. She had just eliminated the last remaining shred of mercy I held for the Ezekiel family. They wanted to play a ruthless game of corporate warfare, using my grandfather's legacy as their poker chips. They wanted to use the legal system to declare me insane and strip me of everything I owned. I walked back to the mahogany desk and opened my encrypted laptop. The screen flickered to life, the Vanguard Trust dashboard glowing brightly in the dim room. I pulled out my burner phone and dialed Valerie Sterling's private line. She answered on the first ring. "Valerie?" I said, my voice echoing coldly off the walls of the suite. "Draft a subpoena for Bishop Ezekiel's personal financial records. Subpoena the church's offshore holding accounts and call the federal investigators back. We are not just stopping a foreclosure anymore. We are tearing down the entire cathedral." Valerie remained entirely silent on the other end of the line for exactly 4 seconds after I gave the order to subpoena my father's offshore accounts. When she finally spoke, her voice was stripped of its usual razor-sharp sarcasm. It was dead serious. "Zuri, you need to sit down," Valerie commanded, the sound of furious typing echoing through the receiver. "We are past the point of simple subpoenas. I just pulled the county docket, and we have been hit with an ex parte emergency court injunction. Harrison and your father did not just file a forged power of attorney with the bank. They went straight to a judge at midnight." I gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, my knuckles turning white. "What kind of injunction?" "A temporary guardianship order," Valerie replied, her tone dropping into a grave, clinical register. Bishop Ezekiel and Harrison bypassed the standard legal waiting periods by paying off a shady, highly controversial private psychiatrist named Dr. Eris Thorne. Thorne is a notorious gun for hire in Atlanta. He specializes in rubber stamping medical evaluations for wealthy families who need to quietly lock away problematic relatives. Thorne signed a sworn medical affidavit claiming you are completely psychologically unstable and a direct danger to yourself. I let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. I have never even met Dr. Eris Thorne. How could a sitting judge grant a conservatorship without a physical psychological evaluation? Because your father leveraged his absolute moral authority in this city to sell a beautifully crafted, heartbreaking tragedy to the court, Valerie explained, reading directly from the digital court filing. They painted a picture of a woman spiraling into total financial and mental ruin. The affidavit cites your sudden job loss at the financial strategy firm last month. Harrison deliberately orchestrated that termination, Zuri. He used his billionaire investors to threaten your former boss into firing you solely to establish a documented history of sudden professional instability. My blood ran ice cold as the sheer calculated magnitude of their conspiracy fell into place. They had been setting the stage for my destruction long before my grandfather's trust was even unlocked. "And it gets worse," Valerie continued, her voice tightening. "They cited homelessness on Christmas as the primary evidence of your mental decline. They told the judge that you were so psychologically damaged, you refused to live in the family home, choosing instead to wander the streets during the holidays. They know exactly where I was on Christmas," I fired back, my voice vibrating with pure rage. "I was sleeping on a cot in the back room of the community center, auditing the fraudulent zoning permits Harrison was trying to sneak past the city council. I was protecting Jeremiah's property." "The judge does not know that," Valerie stated bluntly. "The judge only knows what Bishop Ezekiel, a highly respected religious pillar of the community, told him under oath. Your father swore you were a vagrant. He swore you were incapable of managing a checking account, let alone a multi-million-dollar commercial trust." The judge granted your father temporary conservatorship over Jeremiah's estate at 6 o'clock this morning. Harrison is currently holding the legal authority to liquidate the church land, and he is moving to finalize the bank transfer today. We have an emergency contestation hearing at the Fulton County Courthouse in exactly 2 hours. Get dressed, Zuri. We are fighting for your sanity. I ended the call and walked directly to the bathroom mirror. The woman staring back at me was not a victim. She was the sole legitimate heir to a $42 million empire, and she was about to absolutely decimate the men trying to steal it. I adjusted the collar of my charcoal gray suit, reapplied a sharp dark red lipstick, and picked up my encrypted phone. The Fulton County Courthouse was a towering fortress of white marble and heavy oak. The air inside the vast corridors smelled of floor wax and quiet desperation. I walked through the metal detectors with my head held high, the sharp click of my stilettos echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Valerie was already waiting for me near the clerk's desk on the 4th floor, clutching a thick leather briefcase packed with our counter motions. She gave me a brief, grim nod before disappearing into the judge's chambers to file the emergency contestation paperwork. I was left standing alone in the long, dimly lit hallway outside courtroom 4. I turned toward the tall arched windows overlooking the Atlanta skyline, mentally preparing for the brutal legal fight ahead. I did not hear the footsteps approaching until the heavy scent of expensive cologne filled the space directly behind me. Enjoying the view while you still can, I turned around slowly. Harrison stood blocking the narrow corridor completely alone. His silver Porsche Panamera keys dangled casually from his fingers. The panicked, trembling mess of a man I had confronted at the demolition site was entirely gone. With the emergency court injunction securely in his pocket, he had regained every ounce of his unearned arrogance. He dropped the polite, respectful ally mask he normally wore around my family. He looked at me with a cold, predatory smugness that made my skin crawl. "You really thought a piece of paper from a dead man was going to stop me from taking what I need?" Harrison sneered, stepping aggressively into my personal space. "You have no idea how the real world works, Zuri. You think you are some brilliant strategist because you can read a spreadsheet, but you completely lack the sophistication to sit at the adult table." I maintained a stony, unbroken silence, letting him dig his own grave. Harrison leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low, vicious whisper, filled with racial microaggressions and unchecked elitism. "Those historic black neighborhoods you are so obsessed with saving are already dead. They are rotting. They are nothing but a stain on the city's property values. My conglomerate is doing this city a favor by cleaning up the ghetto. We are going to bulldoze that pathetic community center, rip up that filthy barbershop, and build luxury condominiums for people who actually matter. People who can actually afford to live there. And the best part is your own father is helping me drive the bulldozers." He smiled, a terrible, terrifying expression of absolute greed. "Your own father handed me the keys to his kingdom, Zuri. You're fighting biology and capitalism. You were always the broken link in this family." He let the insult hang in the sterile air of the courthouse hallway, waiting for me to shatter. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to lash out and prove the fabricated medical affidavit right. He needed a witness to see the crazy, unstable sister losing her mind in a public building. I gave him exactly what he wanted. I forced my breathing to hitch, taking a ragged, uneven gasp of air. I let my shoulders slump forward instantly, shrinking my posture to appear small and entirely defeated. I brought both of my hands up to cover my face, my fingers digging into my hair as I let out a loud, pathetic, shaking sob. My entire body trembled with manufactured grief. I wailed into my palms, playing the role of the broken, helpless woman who had finally realized she was completely outmatched by the men in her life. Harrison let out a sharp, victorious laugh. The sound was thick with absolute superiority. He reached out and patted my shoulder with mocking, condescending sympathy. "Do yourself a favor and just go quietly, Zuri," he whispered near my ear. "Before we have the doctors lock you up for real." He turned on his heel and strode confidently down the marble hallway, the metal taps of his expensive shoes clicking out a rhythm of total victory. He pushed open the heavy oak doors of the courtroom, fully expecting to walk in and steal my grandfather's entire legacy. The heavy doors clicked shut behind him, leaving me completely alone in the corridor. I slowly lowered my hands from my face. My cheeks were perfectly dry. My breathing was completely steady. Beneath the cover of my trembling hands, a wide, dangerous smile had stretched across my face. I reached into the breast pocket of my charcoal suit jacket and pulled out my encrypted burner phone. The screen was glowing bright red, displaying a digital sound wave that was actively pulsing across the display. I tapped the center of the screen, stopping the high-definition audio recording. Harrison thought he had just broken me. He had no idea he had just handed me a flawless, time-stamped, unedited confession of his entire criminal conspiracy, spoken freely in a federal building. He had just admitted to manipulating my father, stealing the deeds, and executing a coordinated corporate takeover of a protected historic district. I slid the phone back into my pocket, smoothing the lapels of my suit. The trap had not just snapped shut. It had crushed him completely. I walked out of the Fulton County Courthouse with the posture of a woman who had just conquered a nation. The biting winter air felt sharp and invigorating against my skin. Valerie Sterling was waiting in the idling black SUV at the bottom of the marble steps. I slid into the rich leather seat and closed the door, instantly sealing out the noise of the city. I pulled the burner phone from my pocket, unlocked the screen, and hit play. Harrison's voice filled the quiet interior of the vehicle in crystal-clear, high-definition audio. Every racial slur, every admission of corporate fraud, every detailed boast about manipulating my father to steal the historic district echoed off the tinted windows. Valerie sat perfectly still, listening to the recording with her eyes closed. When the audio finally clicked off, she opened her eyes. A slow, terrifying smile spread across her face. It was the look of an apex predator that had just cornered its prey. "We do not play this tape in a state court," Valerie instructed, her voice buzzing with adrenaline. "A local judge might try to seal the evidence to protect Bishop Ezekiel's public standing. We take this directly to the federal level. This is wire fraud conspiracy to commit fraud and a direct violation of federal banking statutes. But before we drop the hammer, we need to know exactly how deep the rot goes." I nodded, pulling out my black Vanguard debit card. I authorized Valerie to drain whatever operating capital she needed. I told her to hire the most ruthless, thorough forensic accountants in the Southeast. I wanted Harrison's entire corporate life dissected down to the very last cent. I wanted every shell company exposed, every offshore account unmasked, and every single contract he had ever placed in front of my father scrutinized. For the next 5 days, I completely vanished. I went absolutely dark, maintaining total radio silence. I did not answer calls. I did not respond to the barrage of hateful text messages from my extended family. I allowed my phone to fill up with voicemails from church elders condemning my supposedly unstable behavior. By disappearing, I gave my family exactly what they wanted: the illusion of total victory. Operating under the assumption that I had suffered a complete psychological breakdown in the courthouse hallway, Harrison ran straight back to Bishop Ezekiel's sprawling executive parsonage to claim his crown. Through the quiet intelligence network I had maintained among the church's administrative staff, I received real-time updates on their pathetic celebrations. Harrison and my father sat in the bishop's private study, drinking expensive scotch and toasting to the successful containment of the family problem. They truly believed the temporary conservatorship had solved all their financial disasters. My mother and sister were even worse. Emboldened by their supposed triumph, Corinne and Iman went on a highly publicized, deeply offensive victory tour. Iman posted a barrage of videos from luxury boutiques in Buckhead, flashing expensive designer bags, while preaching to her millions of followers about the power of prayer and overcoming familial spiritual warfare. Corinne used the church's weekly broadcast to ask the congregation to pray for a troubled soul who had lost her way, twisting my forced silence into proof of my insanity. They were practically dancing on what they believed was my financial grave. They were spending money they did not have, celebrating a victory they had not actually won. While they paraded their arrogance across social media, I was locked inside a highly secure windowless boardroom that Valerie had rented under a dummy corporation on the outskirts of Atlanta. The room was swept daily for listening devices. The walls were lined with whiteboards detailing the complex tangled web of Harrison Development Group. I barely slept. I existed on black coffee and the pure burning desire to completely dismantle the people who had tried to discard me. On the evening of the 5th day, the heavy electronic lock on the boardroom door buzzed open. Valerie walked in carrying a massive, thick red dossier. The heavy binder landed on the glass conference table with a loud, resounding thud. "The forensic audit is complete," Valerie announced, pulling out a chair and sitting down. Her usual sharp demeanor was replaced by something approaching sheer disbelief. She looked at me with an expression that was halfway between horror and professional awe. "You thought your brother-in-law was just trying to steal a $40 million plot of land to save his business. You severely underestimated his greed." I pulled the red dossier toward me and flipped open the heavy cover. The first 50 pages detailed exactly what I already suspected. Harrison's conglomerate was not just facing bankruptcy, it was an absolute financial crater. He owed tens of millions to a syndicate of ruthless, highly dangerous private equity investors. He had been running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme for years, using funds from new projects to cover the massive losses of his old ones. The community center land was supposed to be his ultimate bailout. But as I turned to the section detailing the specific legal contracts Bishop Ezekiel had signed under the guise of the medical conservatorship, my breath caught in my throat. I stared at the heavily redacted financial structures, my eyes tracking the routing numbers and collateral agreements. I traced the flow of liabilities from Harrison's shell companies directly into the primary accounts of Greater Grace Cathedral. My father had not just signed a document authorizing the demolition of the community center. In his absolute desperation to protect his public empire and his blind, foolish trust in a white son-in-law who spoke the language of corporate development, Ezekiel had bypassed his own legal counsel. He had signed a massive stack of cross-collateralization agreements without reading the fine print. Valerie tapped a manicured fingernail against a specific clause highlighted in bright yellow ink. Harrison didn't just leverage the community center deeds, Valerie stated, her voice slicing through the quiet room. Because Bishop Ezekiel used his absolute authority to override your trust, he inadvertently linked the holding company directly to the church's primary assets. Harrison used that linkage to secure his bailout. He put the entire megachurch up as collateral. I gasped, the sheer magnitude of the betrayal hitting me like a physical shockwave. Harrison was not just stealing my grandfather's land, he was taking the cathedral. He had legally transferred ownership of the 20,000-seat sanctuary, the broadcast center, and the executive parsonage directly to his private equity investors to cover his debts. The moment Harrison defaulted on his payments, which the audit proved was mathematically inevitable, the investors would seize the entire church compound. My father, a man who had spent his entire life preaching about vigilance and spiritual warfare, had literally handed the deed to his own megachurch to a common thief just to keep up appearances. Ezekiel and Corinne had thrown me to the wolves to protect an empire that they no longer even owned. "When does the transfer execute?" I demanded, my eyes flying across the dense legal jargon searching for the activation date. "When does the bank officially seize the property?" Valerie flipped to the final page of the dossier, pointing to a stark, bolded date at the bottom of the master contract. The financial trigger was not tied to a standard 30-day business cycle. Harrison had structured the execution date to coincide with the end of the fiscal year to avoid immediate detection by the church's internal accounting department. "It is programmed to auto-execute at exactly midnight on December 31st, Valerie said, closing the folder. I stared at the date, a slow, dark realization creeping over my features. December 31st, New Year's Eve. Greater Grace Cathedral did not just host a standard watch night service. They hosted the most lavish, extravagant, multi-million-dollar New Year's Eve gala in the entire state of Georgia. It was Bishop Ezekiel and First Lady Corinne's crowning social event. Politicians, celebrities, and religious leaders from across the country flew in to walk the red carpet and sit at tables that cost $50,000 apiece. It was the ultimate display of their wealth, their power, and their untouchable status. And at exactly midnight, while my parents were standing on stage, dressed in custom couture, ringing in the new year in front of thousands of their most important donors, the federal execution order would automatically trigger. The bank would seize the building, the gates would be locked, the assets would be frozen. Bishop Ezekiel and First Lady Corinne were about to be completely ruined, stripped of their power and rendered entirely homeless on live television, and they had absolutely no idea it was coming. The grand ballroom of the Atlanta Country Club was a masterclass in weaponized opulence. Thousands of white orchids cascaded from towering crystal vases, framing the room in a pristine manufactured purity. Waiters in white tuxedo jackets glided silently across the polished marble floors, keeping the Dom Perignon flowing into the glasses of politicians, federal judges, wealthy congregants, and a carefully curated selection of corporate investors. It was the premier social event of the year, the Greater Grace Cathedral New Year's Eve Gala, and my family was holding court at the absolute center of it all. Bishop Ezekiel stood behind a transparent acrylic podium on the elevated main stage. He wore a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo, his chest puffed out with the supreme arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable. Behind him, massive digital projection screens displayed a gorgeous high-definition architectural rendering of the new community center and the planned expansions for the megachurch. We are not just building a structure, we are building a generational legacy. My father's booming baritone echoed through the state-of-the-art surround sound system. He raised his champagne flute, gesturing generously toward the front table. When this family faced unprecedented challenges, when the burden of leadership grew heavy, and the path forward seemed obscured by the selfish actions of those who had lost their way, one man stepped up to carry the mantle. I ask you all to raise your glasses to my son-in-law Harrison. He is the visionary savior of this community, the architect of our future, and a true pillar of the Ezekiel family. The ballroom erupted into thunderous, polite applause. At the head table, Harrison stood up and offered a humble, practiced wave to the crowd. He looked like the perfect corporate prince. Sitting right beside him was my sister Iman. She wore a blush pink designer gown that perfectly accented her glowing, curated aesthetic. She rested one manicured hand delicately over her supposedly pregnant stomach, smiling demurely for the event photographers snapping pictures from the aisles. She was soaking up the adoration, completely intoxicated by the wealth and respectability she had stolen. They were celebrating their absolute victory. They had no idea the clock had just run out. The heavy brass-studded oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open with a definitive heavy thud. The sound was loud enough to catch the attention of the tables near the entrance. I stepped into the warm, champagne-scented air of the gala. I was not the broken, homeless, psychologically unstable vagrant my father had sworn under oath that I was. I wore a custom floor-length emerald silk gown that fit like liquid armor. Around my neck and wrists rested over $2 million in flawless, brilliant cut diamonds. My posture was rigid, my chin held high, and my eyes were locked dead ahead. I walked down the center aisle of the ballroom with the slow, deliberate rhythm of an executioner. The reaction rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. Conversations abruptly died. Champagne glasses froze halfway to people's mouths. The wealthy congregants who had spent the last 2 weeks consuming my father's smear campaign stared at me in absolute, breathless shock. I could hear the sharp gasps and the frantic, hushed whispers erupting from the tables as I passed. "Is that Zuri? I thought the bishop said she was institutionalized. Look at her, she does not look insane at all." I ignored every single glare, every gasp, and every pointing finger. I kept my eyes fixed on the stage. From the corner of my vision, I saw my mother, First Lady Corinne, stand up so fast her chair nearly toppled backward. Her face went ashen, the perfect serene mask of the pastor's wife completely shattering. She stepped into the aisle, her hands outstretched in a frantic attempt to intercept me before I could ruin the optics of her perfect night. "Zuri? What on earth do you think you are doing?" Corinne hissed, keeping her voice low but vibrating with panic. "You are not supposed to be here. Security is supposed to keep you out. You are embarrassing your father in front of the governor." I did not even break my stride. I breezed past her, the train of my emerald silk gown brushing against her shoes. My mother had spent my entire life prioritizing the appearance of our family over the actual well-being of her children. She had happily stood by while my father declared me legally insane just to protect the church's bank accounts. Her frantic attempts at damage control meant absolutely nothing to me now. I bypassed the head table entirely. Harrison's smug, triumphant smile vanished the second we made eye contact. He froze his champagne flute hovering in the air. Iman's jaw dropped, her hand slipping away from her stomach as genuine, paralyzing panic flooded her eyes. They both knew I should have been completely crushed under the weight of their corporate lawyers. Seeing me standing there, practically dripping in wealth and absolute confidence, broke their reality. Instead of walking up to the stage to confront my father, I veered sharply to the left, stepping into the shadows of the massive elevated sound and lighting booth overlooking the ballroom. The chief audio-visual technician was a young man in his 20s. He was sitting behind a massive console of glowing buttons and sliders, wearing a headset around his neck. When he saw me step into the booth, his eyes blew wide. He knew exactly who I was. Everyone in that church knew who I was. "Miss Ezekiel," he stammered, scrambling to stand up. "You cannot be back here. This is a restricted area. I am going to have to call security." I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. I reached into my diamond-studded clutch, pulled out a sleek black flash drive, and placed it directly into the center of his soundboard. I leaned in close, resting my hands flat against the console. The scent of my expensive perfume mixed with the metallic smell of the electronic equipment. "Plug that drive into the main projection feed," I commanded, my voice dropping to a glacial, uncompromising register. The technician swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he looked at the drive. "I cannot do that. The bishop gave me a strict run of show for the gala. If I interrupt his toast, he will fire me on the spot." I stared dead into his terrified eyes. I let the full weight of my actual financial power press down on him. "Play it," I whispered, enunciating every single syllable with lethal precision. "Or I buy this country club tomorrow morning and you will never work in the city of Atlanta again." The technician looked at my diamonds, looked at my face, and realized instantly that I was not making an empty threat. His hands shook violently as he grabbed the black flash drive and jammed it into the master input port on the console. He frantically typed a sequence of commands into his keyboard, his fingers slipping on the keys. On the main stage, Bishop Ezekiel was entirely oblivious to the hostile takeover happening in the shadows. He was leaning into the microphone, his voice swelling toward a dramatic crescendo. And so as we look toward this brilliant new year, we look toward Harrison Development Group, we look toward prosperity, we look toward truth. The technician hit the master override key. The soaring, triumphant instrumental music that had been playing softly beneath my father's speech cut out with a sharp, brutal electronic screech. The massive high-definition projection screens behind the podium instantly shifted. The gorgeous sunlit architectural renderings of the new church expansion vanished into the digital void. They were immediately replaced by stark black and white legal documents blown up to 20 feet tall for every single billionaire politician and congregant in the room to read. On the left screen flashed Harrison Development Group's highly classified internal accounting ledgers. The documents clearly highlighted tens of millions of dollars in catastrophic debt, detailing the exact flow of funds moving through his illegal offshore shell companies. It was the undeniable mathematical proof of a massive long-running Ponzi scheme. On the right screen flashed the emergency medical conservatorship affidavit. The document was magnified to show Dr. Eris Thorne's signature completely unredacted, right next to the sworn fabricated statements claiming I was a homeless, unstable vagrant. Beside it was the digital timestamp of a wire transfer showing a massive payoff sent from Harrison's personal account directly to the disgraced doctor's private clinic. The absolute silence that hit the grand ballroom was deafening. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum that sucked the oxygen straight out of the room. Bishop Ezekiel froze at the podium. He turned his head slowly, looking back at the massive screens. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. The microphone picked up the ragged, panicked gasp that escaped his throat, broadcasting his terror to the entire room. At the head table, Harrison dropped his champagne flute. The crystal glass hit the marble floor and shattered into 1,000 pieces. The sharp, violent crash echoed through the dead silence of the ballroom. He stared up at his own bankruptcy filings, his face twisting into an expression of absolute horror. His billionaire investors, the ruthless men sitting at the tables directly in front of him, were currently staring at the hard evidence of their missing money. Iman sat paralyzed, her hands gripping the edges of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. Her perfect, wealthy aesthetic was completely stripped away, leaving nothing but a terrified fraud staring at the very public end of her fake life. I stood in the shadows of the sound booth, perfectly still, watching the destruction unfold. They had tried to paint me as an unstable failure, wrapping their greed in the guise of religious righteousness and family protection. They had underestimated the sheer brutal efficiency of a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. The countdown to midnight was ticking, and they had absolutely no idea that the real trap had not even been sprung yet. I stepped out of the shadows of the sound booth and began my descent down the velvet-lined staircase. The dead silence in the grand ballroom was absolute, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic click of my stilettos against the marble floor. The crowd of Atlanta elite politicians and billionaire investors parted for me like the Red Sea. They stared at my custom emerald silk gown and the $2 million of flawless diamonds resting against my collarbone. I was no longer the outcast daughter they could whisper about. I was the executioner, and I had just locked the doors. I walked directly toward the elevated main stage. A live wedding singer hired to provide the soft jazz backing track for my father's arrogant toast stood frozen near the edge of the platform. His mouth hung slightly open, his hands gripping the microphone stand. I did not ask for permission. I reached out, took the microphone directly from his trembling fingers, and stepped into the harsh, blinding glare of the stage lights. My voice boomed through the massive state-of-the-art surround sound system, echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "Let us talk about the visionary savior of this community," I announced, my tone ringing with a cold, terrifying authority. "Let us talk about the flawless, perfect family you have all been told to worship." I turned my back to the crowd and looked directly at the head table. Iman was entirely paralyzed. Her face was chalk white, her designer gown suddenly looking like a cheap costume. She stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, silently begging me to stop. She had spent 35 years stepping on my neck to elevate her own status, and now she was suffocating under the weight of her own lies. "My perfect, devoted sister," I said. Pacing slowly across the front of the stage, my eyes locked on hers. "Iman has spent the last 5 years selling you all a masterclass in faithful high society perfection. You buy her lifestyle brand, you donate to her charities, you applaud her perfectly curated marriage. But behind the designer bags and the social media filters, my sister is a complete, unmitigated fraud." Iman let out a sharp, pathetic gasp, shaking her head frantically. "Zuri, stop!" She choked out, her voice barely carrying past her table. "She owes the Internal Revenue Service $2 million in unpaid back taxes." I continued, my voice merciless and steady. "Her highly praised lifestyle brand has been completely insolvent for 3 years. She has been secretly siphoning money from the church's youth outreach funds just to pay the minimum balances on her personal credit cards." A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the ballroom. The wealthy congregants who worshipped Iman began to whisper frantically, but I was not finished. I had to deliver the killing blow. "And tonight," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register, "she sat at this table resting her hand on her stomach, accepting your congratulations for a baby that does not exist." Iman screamed. It was a visceral, guttural sound of pure horror. She covered her face with her hands entirely exposed. "My sister is not pregnant," I declared, the sound system amplifying the absolute truth of her deception. "She downloaded a fake ultrasound from the internet to trap Harrison's investors into giving them an extension on their fraudulent loans. She weaponized motherhood to buy herself a few more weeks of luxury. She is a bankrupt, pathological liar who would sell her own flesh and blood to maintain an illusion." The reaction was instantaneous. The wealthy society friends sitting at the tables directly surrounding Iman physically recoiled. Women in expensive gowns literally took a step away from her, pulling their chairs back, as if her sudden toxic poverty was contagious. The golden child of the Ezekiel family was completely, permanently ruined in front of the entire city. I did not wait for the crowd to recover. I turned my attention to the center of the stage. Bishop Ezekiel and First Lady Corinne stood frozen near the acrylic podium. They looked like statues, their faces contorted with a mixture of rage, terror, and profound confusion. My father's chest was heaving beneath his custom midnight blue tuxedo. My mother was clutching her diamond necklace, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her own skin. "You called me a failure?" I said, my voice cutting through the murmurs of the ballroom like a serrated blade. I stared directly into my mother's eyes, watching the panic finally set in. "You called me a disappointment. You called me an ugly dropout. You spent my entire life telling everyone in this room that I was broken simply because I refused to play your shallow, hypocritical games." My father opened his mouth to speak, to launch into one of his booming, authoritative sermons, but I stepped closer, silencing him with a single burning glare. "You threw me into the freezing rain on Christmas Eve," I stated, the raw, unvarnished truth echoing off the walls. "You threw your own daughter out onto the street to protect a man who just legally stole your church." Bishop Ezekiel flinched as if he had been physically struck. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice cracking, entirely devoid of its usual power. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the small digital remote I had taken from the sound booth. I clicked a single button. The massive projection screens behind them shifted again. The medical records vanished, replaced by the dense, incredibly complex fine print of the master contract Harrison had placed in front of my father just hours ago. I had highlighted one specific, devastating paragraph in bright crimson ink. "You were so desperate to strip me of my grandfather's land," I explained, walking toward them with the slow, predatory grace of a woman who had already won. "You were so terrified of a public scandal that you signed an emergency conservatorship override without letting your own legal counsel read the fine print. You gave Harrison absolute financial authority over the Ezekiel Trust. But Harrison did not just leverage the community center, Dad." I gestured to the massive screens behind him. "Read the cross-collateralization clause," I commanded. Bishop Ezekiel slowly turned around. He stared up at the magnified legal text. I watched his eyes track across the highlighted words. I watched his shoulders slump. I watched the absolute world-shattering realization hit him like a freight train. Harrison tied his failing shell companies directly to the primary assets of Greater Grace Cathedral, I announced to the dead silent room. When he defaulted on his loans, which he already has, the creditors were legally authorized to seize the collateral. "You do not just lose the community center, Dad. You no longer own this ministry. You no longer own the 20,000-seat sanctuary. You no longer own the broadcast network, and you no longer own the executive parsonage. You gave it all to Harrison, and Harrison gave it to the bank." Corinne let out a piercing, hysterical wail, her knees buckling beneath her. My father caught her by the arm, his face completely drained of blood. He looked like a man who had just been handed a death sentence. His entire empire, his legacy, his absolute power in the city of Atlanta, wiped out by his own arrogant signature. "The transfer is set to auto-execute at midnight tonight." I checked the diamond watch on my wrist. "In exactly 14 minutes, the bank seizes the building. You are completely bankrupt and you are about to be homeless." The ballroom descended into absolute chaos. The billionaire private equity investors sitting in the front row abruptly stood up. They realized instantly that the man they had trusted with their money was a total fraud. They began pulling out their phones, shouting furiously at their legal teams, demanding immediate action against Harrison Development Group. The polished, elegant gala had turned into a corporate slaughterhouse. At the head table, Harrison snapped. The slick, sophisticated veneer he had used to con his way into the highest circles of Atlanta society shattered into a million jagged pieces. He was entirely exposed. His investors were turning on him, his wife was publicly ruined, and the black woman he had constantly underestimated had just systematically dismantled his entire life in under 5 minutes. His face contorted with a violent, animalistic rage. He kicked his chair backwards, sending it crashing to the marble floor. "You pathetic arrogant," he roared, his voice cracking with pure hysteria. Harrison lunged. He vaulted off the edge of the stage, his hands curled into fists, charging directly at me. The polite, respectful corporate prince was gone. He unleashed a barrage of vile, hateful racial slurs, screaming at the top of his lungs as he sprinted across the gap between the tables. He was a cornered, rabid animal, entirely out of his mind, intending to tear me apart with his bare hands. Harrison was a blur of tailored tuxedo and blind, feral rage. He closed the distance between the head table and the sound booth with terrifying speed, his hands outstretched like claws aiming directly for my throat. The vile, hateful racial slurs tearing from his mouth echoed through the massive ballroom speakers, broadcasting the true ugly nature of the man my father had crowned as a savior. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I simply stood my ground in my emerald gown, watching him charge headlong toward his own destruction. Before his manicured hands could even graze the silk of my dress, the heavy brass double doors at the back of the ballroom blew open with the force of an explosion. Federal agents wearing heavy tactical vests and dark windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI swarmed into the opulent space. Valerie Sterling and her team of forensic accountants had done their jobs flawlessly. They had not just audited Harrison Development Group. They had compiled a bulletproof, irrefutable dossier of wire fraud, interstate racketeering, and conspiracy, handing it directly to the federal prosecutor's office just hours before the gala began. "Federal agents, get on the ground," a commanding voice roared over the chaos. 3 heavily armed agents intercepted Harrison at the base of the sound booth stairs. They hit him like a freight train. The impact sent Harrison crashing backward onto the polished marble stage. His custom tuxedo ripped at the shoulder as the agents pinned him down, pressing his face roughly into the cold floor. The silver tray of champagne glasses he had knocked over dug into his cheek, shattering beneath his weight. Harrison thrashed violently, spitting and screaming, his veneer of corporate respectability completely obliterated. "Stop resisting," an agent shouted forcefully, wrenching Harrison's arms behind his back. The sharp, heavy click of steel handcuffs echoed over the sound system, a definitive period to his fraudulent reign. They dragged him to his feet. His hair was disheveled, his face red and sweating, his eyes wild with the realization that he was going straight to federal prison. The grand ballroom instantly devolved into a scene of unprecedented apocalyptic panic. The carefully curated atmosphere of untouchable wealth vanished, replaced by the primal scramble of self-preservation. The billionaire private equity investors, the very men Harrison had conned out of tens of millions of dollars, were completely unhinged. They overturned their $50,000 tables in their rush to get away from the blast radius. Men in bespoke suits screamed furiously into their cell phones, ordering their legal teams to freeze assets, seize offshore accounts, and initiate emergency litigation against anyone holding the Harrison name. The politicians, city council members, and federal judges, recognizing the catastrophic optics of being associated with a massive federal fraud raid at a megachurch, bolted for the exits. They abandoned their spouses, their expensive coats, and their half-finished drinks, shoving past the terrified congregation members in a desperate bid to escape before the local news crews arrived. The loyal church members, who had blindly followed my father's every command, were weeping, clutching each other, as the spiritual empire they had funded with their tithes crumbled before their eyes. Iman was sobbing hysterically, backed into a corner by the shattered remains of the head table. Her wealthy Buckhead society friends, the women she had spent years cultivating and desperate to impress, cast her looks of pure, unadulterated disgust. They literally physically backed away from her, hiking up the skirts of their designer gowns to avoid touching her. She was a pariah, entirely isolated in a crowd of hundreds, her fake pregnancy and massive tax debt turning her into social poison. On the main stage, the full crushing weight of the situation finally broke First Lady Corinne. She stood trembling next to my father, her eyes darting frantically from the handcuffed form of her perfect son-in-law, being hauled out the doors, to the furious investors screaming lawsuits, to the projection screens still flashing the stark, undeniable proof that Greater Grace Cathedral was permanently lost. The executive parsonage was gone. The broadcast network was gone. Her designer wardrobe, her private jets, her absolute unquestioned authority over the thousands of people who had worshipped her. all of it had been signed away by her own husband's foolish, arrogant hand. In the span of 5 minutes, she had been reduced from a queen to a beggar. Her knees buckled. The strength completely left her legs. Corinne collapsed onto the hard marble stage, the heavy silk and tulle of her custom couture gown pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She let out a horrific guttural wail, a sound of pure devastation that cut through the shouting of the fleeing crowd. My father, Bishop Ezekiel, simply stared straight ahead, entirely catatonic. His mind was unable to process the absolute ruin of his generational legacy. He had thrown his own flesh and blood to the wolves to save an empire, only to realize he had handed the keys to the wolves himself. He was a ruined man standing in the wreckage of his own hubris. I stepped out from the shadows of the sound booth and walked slowly toward the center of the stage. The federal agents were securing the area, establishing a perimeter, but they parted to let me through. They knew exactly who had handed them the silver bullet. I walked with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a woman who had just conquered a nation. Corinne looked up through her tears as my shadow fell over her. Her perfect makeup was smeared black mascara running down her cheeks in jagged, ugly lines. The serene, untouchable pastor's wife was entirely gone. When she saw me standing above her, bathed in the harsh stage lights and dripping in diamonds, her survival instinct kicked into overdrive. She scrambled forwards on her hands and knees. She crawled across the marble floor, dragging her ruined gown through the spilled champagne and shattered crystal. She reached out with trembling, desperate hands and grabbed the hem of my emerald silk dress. "Zuri, please," Corinne wailed, her voice cracking with sheer desperation. "We did not know. We had no idea what Harrison was doing. You have to help us." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had happily signed away my freedom, my sanity, and my inheritance just to maintain her social status. "You have the money, Zuri," she sobbed, her fingers clutching frantically at the silk fabric, looking up at me with wild, bloodshot eyes. "You are the head of the trust now. You can pay off the bank. You can save the church. You can fix this. Please, Zuri, you are our daughter." The word echoed through the air. Daughter. It was a title she only chose to remember when she needed something. It was a title she had discarded the moment Dr. Thorne handed her those fraudulent conservatorship papers. I did not step back. I did not pull my dress out of her hands. I simply stood there, an immovable force, feeling absolutely nothing for the pathetic woman weeping at my feet. The anger and the hurt that had driven me for weeks had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, clinical indifference. I slowly raised my left hand and held it up to the stage lights. I tilted my fingers back and forth casually, inspecting my perfectly manicured nails. The $2 million in diamonds around my wrist caught the light, casting brilliant fractured rainbows across my mother's tear-stained face. I looked down at her, my expression completely void of mercy, empathy, or familial duty. "I cannot do anything on my own. Remember?" I said, my voice ringing out through the microphone in my right hand, smooth and cold as glacial ice. "You and Dad swore under penalty of perjury that I was incapable of managing my own affairs." Corinne gasped, shaking her head frantically, her tears splashing onto my shoes as she realized her own weapon had just been turned against her. "But do not worry." I continued, leaning in slightly, delivering the final fatal strike with absolute precision. "I will make sure the community center serves soup to you both when you are evicted next week." I held the microphone out over the marble floor. I opened my fingers. The heavy metal microphone dropped, hitting the stage with a sharp, deafening thud that echoed like a gunshot through the ruined ballroom. I turned my back on my mother, my father, and the shattered remains of Greater Grace Cathedral. I did not look at Iman as she continued to weep in the corner, and I did not look at the federal agents securing the building. I walked down the center aisle, my head held high, my posture unbroken. The heavy oak doors closed firmly behind me as I stepped out into the crisp, clean air of a brand new year. The heavy oak doors closing behind me did not just shut out the panicked, screaming chaos of the gala, they slammed the book shut on the Ezekiel family dynasty forever. The fallout that followed was swift, brutal, and completely absolute. There were no backroom deals to save them. There were no quiet settlements. I had systematically severed every single lifeline they possessed. The federal indictment against Harrison came down before the sun even rose on New Year's Day. Valerie Sterling and her team of ruthless forensic accountants had handed the United States Attorney's Office a flawless, mathematically undeniable roadmap of his entire criminal enterprise. The trial was a media spectacle that captivated the city of Atlanta for weeks. Harrison traded his custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedos and expensive scotch for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit and fluorescent prison lighting. During the sentencing hearing, the judge, a stern federal magistrate who had zero tolerance for white-collar predators, did not mince words. She handed down a maximum 10-year sentence in federal prison for wire fraud, interstate racketeering, and forgery. There was no early parole on the table. There were no comfortable minimum security country club accommodations. Harrison was stripped of his name, his unearned wealth, and his freedom, locked away in a maximum security facility where his silver tongue meant absolutely nothing. Iman's highly curated descent into absolute poverty was a brutal masterclass in karma. The morning after the gala, the IRS descended on her gated suburban mansion like a flock of starved vultures. They seized everything to cover her $2 million tax debt. They took the designer bags she loved to flaunt on social media, the imported Italian furniture, and the luxury vehicles parked in the driveway. Her aspirational lifestyle brand, already rotting from the inside out, filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy before the end of the week. Her wealthy Buckhead society friends, the women she had spent years desperately trying to impress and emulate, vanished instantly. They blocked her number, deleted pictures with her from their feeds, and pretended they had never associated with her. To survive and pay off her staggering federal debt, Iman was forced to take a minimum wage retail job at a discount department store on the opposite side of town. The woman who had built an entire identity on looking down at people was now forced to fold sweaters and scan barcodes for 8 hours a day, wearing a cheap polyester uniform, absolutely terrified of being recognized by former congregants who came in hunting for bargains. My parents faced a ruin that was entirely of their own making. The board of directors at Greater Grace Cathedral convened an emergency session the very next morning. Furious, panicked, and desperate to save whatever fragments of the ministry remained untouched by the FBI raid, they voted unanimously to oust Bishop Ezekiel and First Lady Corinne for gross financial negligence and a profound breach of fiduciary duty. Because my father had eagerly signed away the executive parsonage as collateral in Harrison's fraudulent scheme, the bank foreclosed on their sprawling, opulent estate within 30 days. The luxury church-leased cars were repossessed from their driveway. Their limitless expense accounts were immediately frozen. Stripped of their sacred titles, their unearned wealth, and their suffocating pride, Ezekiel and Corinne were forced to pack whatever clothes they could fit into a rented moving truck. They relocated to a tiny, cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a decaying building on the far outskirts of the city. There were no more red carpets to walk. There were no more $50,000 tables to hold court over. My mother, who had spent her entire life prioritizing respectability politics and social status over her own children, now spent her days staring out of a cracked window at a busy, smog-filled highway, living in the exact kind of grinding poverty she had always openly despised. My father, a man whose booming baritone voice used to command 20,000 people every Sunday, sat in absolute silence in a worn second-hand armchair. He possessed no pulpit, no congregation, and no power. They were entirely forgotten. 6 months later, the bitter winter air had completely surrendered to the bright, heavy heat of an Atlanta summer. I stood on the sprawling wraparound balcony of my new penthouse, a sleek, modern fortress in the sky. The glass railing offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the historic district below, but the landscape looked entirely different from what my family had intended. I had not sold a single inch of Grandfather Jeremiah's land to corporate developers. The predatory, soulless skyscrapers Harrison had designed remained nothing more than deleted digital files on a confiscated hard drive. Instead, I had utilized the full unlocked financial power of my trust to transform my grandfather's entire block into a massive, thriving hub for Black female entrepreneurs. The community center had been fully restored and expanded, but it was no longer a crumbling relic fighting for survival. It was a state-of-the-art incubator. The surrounding lots now featured beautifully designed storefronts, collaborative workspaces, and modern corporate offices leased exclusively to women of color who had previously been denied funding by traditional banking institutions. Valerie Sterling stepped out onto the balcony, her heels clicking softly against the expensive tile. She handed me a crystal flute filled with chilled champagne. We clinked glasses, the sharp, clear sound ringing in the warm air. She handed me a thick, leather-bound financial summary, tapping a manicured fingernail against the bottom line. The trust had tripled in value over the last 2 quarters. The businesses we had funded were generating massive, sustainable profits, pouring wealth directly back into the community my father had been so eager to bulldoze for his own glory. I had taken the very land they tried to steal and turned it into an impenetrable fortress of generational wealth. Later that afternoon, the street in front of the newly renovated block was completely shut down to traffic. A massive crowd had gathered under the bright, brilliant sunshine. It was not a congregation of blind, fearful followers, but a powerful gathering of community leaders, local business owners, and fierce, independent women. I stood at the center of the crowd wearing a sharp, impeccably tailored ivory suit that radiated absolute power and uncompromising freedom. I was hosting the official ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Jeremiah Financial Literacy Center, a dedicated facility designed to teach young women of color how to build credit-secure commercial loans and protect their assets from corporate predators. The energy in the air was electric. I was incredibly wealthy, deeply respected, and entirely free from the toxic chains of my family's suffocating respectability politics. I had torn down the cage they built for me and constructed an empire of my own making. As the crowd cheered and the local press photographers snapped pictures, I felt a slight hesitant tug on the sleeve of my ivory blazer. I looked down to see a young Black girl, maybe 12 or 13 years old, looking up at me with wide, completely awestruck eyes. She wore a bright yellow dress and held a small, worn notebook clutched tightly against her chest. She looked at the massive, gleaming buildings behind me, then back up at my face. "Miss Zuri," she asked, her voice quiet but vibrating with genuine curiosity. "How did you do it? How did you manage to build all of this?" I looked out at the thriving businesses, the women walking confidently through the glass doors of the literacy center, and the absolute reality of the empire I had permanently secured. I looked back down at the young girl, seeing the brilliant, untapped potential shining in her eyes. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne, letting the crisp, cold liquid ground me in the reality of my absolute victory. I smiled. It was not a polite, manufactured smile designed to make other people comfortable. It was the fierce, unapologetic smile of a woman who knew exactly what she was worth. I just stopped waiting for an invitation to their table. I told her, my voice ringing out clearly in the warm afternoon air. And I bought the whole building instead. I handed my empty champagne flute to a passing waiter, turned away from the flashing cameras, and walked straight through the front doors of my own kingdom. The greatest lesson from this journey is that your worth is never defined by a toxic family. When the people who should protect you choose to tear you down instead, you do not have to accept their false narrative. Real power comes from walking away from their table and building your own beautiful empire. True justice is not merely watching those who wronged you face the dark consequences of their greed. It is thriving unapologetically and creating safe spaces where others can succeed. We want to hear how you cut ties to protect your peace. Please share your stories below.